Welcome back to the Pylon Show. I am Artosis, and this is episode number 97. As people may have noticed, we did not have an episode last week, and that was because of what we're going to be talking about here today, which is the MeToo movement. It kind of hit last week, maybe a day or two before the Pylon Show, and really started to grow. So we wanted to take that week off, kind of gather our thoughts, see what happened, and then come back with an episode like the one that you're going to see here. So this is a very important topic. We're not going to be going through This Week in StarCraft. We're not going to be going through any sort of StarCraft news, no sponsor plugs or anything like that. We're just going to talk about the subject. And at the end, we'll answer Patreon questions that pertain to the topic. And other Patreon questions, you can either edit your question if you want, or we'll just push it to next week. So sorry about that for anyone who really wanted to know what a Ascension hot dog would think or something like that. We'll take care of you next week. But yeah, let me go ahead and introduce you guys. Nero, of course, you've been on the show a lot. Can you just introduce yourself briefly for everyone?
What's up? I'm Nero. I stream Zerg a whole bunch. I cheekily set my Twitter tag as the Professor of Respect. And this topic, I feel, is one that is not a fun one to talk about, but it's a really big deal that affects a lot of people. And if we really care about our community and what they're going through, being able to address this, hear their stories, and provide support is more important than ever. So thank you for having me on. We have a lot of stuff to tackle, from the negatives to the positive. This is a year of great upheaval. People are in a lot of pain. There's a lot of stress on the world. So the pandemic is a catalyst to some conversations that have been a long time coming. So I'm glad to have it here with you.
Well, thank you for coming on. And that Bronze Girl, this is your first Pylon show, and thank you for coming on. Can you kind of introduce yourself a little bit?
Super excited to be here. Hi, hello, I'm that Bronze Girl. Yeah, I'm not really in the StarCraft 2 community, even though that's why I originally started watching Twitch, but I'm adjacent to a lot of people who are luminaries of the StarCraft community because of D&D and Warhammer. So our nerderies are adjacent. That's who I am.
Excellent. Okay, so yeah, we have kind of this. First off, again, thank you guys both for coming on. It's a really hard topic to speak about, but I think that we can have some good conversations about it, and we'll do our best to everyone out there. I hope we can hit upon all the different important topics here and have a good conversation, I guess. So I guess let's start off with kind of why this can't really be ignored. I was talking to both of you behind the scenes about this and how we can approach this. And Bronsko, you point out, some people are even saying they're getting tired of hearing it, the negativity and all that. What would you guys have to say about that and the fact that this is happening, like that we need to talk about it and everything?
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it is exhausting to talk about it. It's not a fun topic, and there's a lot of stuff happening in the world right now, and I think in general, people are very exhausted. And although I think it's important to take care of your mental health and take breaks as is needed, this isn't something that's going to go away. And I think that is oftentimes our response to this is, I'm just going to look the other way and hope that this blows over. But the reality is that what's happening right now is years of people looking the other way and waiting for things to blow over.
The way that I see it is we've had a pretty long period of unprecedented peace and stability. If you look at the 90s and the aughts so far, if you're comparing that to the history of humanity, it's been more free and peaceful and good than ever before, but there's still a lot of injustice and a lot of evil in the world. And with the global pandemic, we have a catalyst for many people who really want these issues to be resolved. A lot of people who have been going through painful circumstances for a long time, and it's risky and it's dangerous to come out with a story of something that happened to you. So there's strength in numbers in this sense. A lot of people are like, why is everyone bringing up their stuff right now? Once a few people start sharing their stories, that gives them the courage to share theirs as well. It's heavy. It's not fun. And talking about this stuff is really rough. But one of the most important things that you can do if you're a member of the community, maybe you're not a survivor of abuse or anything, but being able to support and listen goes a really long way in looking out for your friends. So,
Yeah,
yeah, maybe you didn't do anything wrong per se, but you can definitely listen and we can all improve.
yeah, definitely. And I mean, I like what you said there. The I feel like the focus, Bronze. Again, I think you said this actually in our little chat before, or maybe it was you, Nora, I can't remember. But focusing on the survivors of these abuses as opposed to putting the bad people on trial or something like that. Like because as I've watched this, I've read so much, and it's like emotionally so draining. It's been like so depressing for the past couple weeks to read all these terrible things that are happening. And I've seen a big mixture. A lot of people that are being supportive to people who come out, and then a lot of people that are kind of attacking the people who have done these things. So I'd love to get your guys' thoughts kind of on that balance and how it should be handled.
Well, I think there's this whole misconstruing of when people say, believe women. Um, a lot of times people take that and they think, "Oh, does that mean that you're just innocent? You're not innocent until proven guilty anymore?" And I think it's that the reason that, sexual assault and rape is so underreported is because a lot of times people don't believe women or they minimize like their experiences. And I mean, I've had that happen to me where I thought someone was being creepy to me and everyone was like, "Oh, they're probably just flirting or they're probably just doing that." And it's like, well, why should I have to put up with that? There's no, the males, my male peers don't have to put up with that. Why am I putting up with that? And so there's this like general idea of like, oh, hand waving it away. So I think that when people say believe women, they're not saying, let's stone all of these men who have been accused. I think they're saying like, don't let your first reaction be to defend these people you watch or defend your friends, but instead say, I hear you. I'm really sorry that happened to you. Because ultimately, like Twitter is not a court of law. And I don't think anybody is expecting you to dispense justice on these people so much as they're saying, when you say to believe women, let women know, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Like, thank you for coming forward. How can we support you? And that those questions and supporting in that way is much more important than like, let's go find this dude and beat the brakes off of him. Cause I don't think anybody is trying to say that.
Mm.
We're also in the internet age as well, so there are different ways that people can be communicating poorly to one another. A lot of stuff happens online. People get harassed in their stream, they get harassed in Discord and DMs and that kind of thing. And there aren't the systems in place to administer justice in a lot of places where someone needs justice, basically. So community justice is the only kind that we can get with this. For someone to share their story, that's
Mm.
about as far as things can go, because some things that happen may be terrible, but there may not be laws or procedures in place to hold the responsible parties accountable. That really sucks. Basically, you've been the victim of abuse and you can't do anything about it except maybe tell someone. But even then, are they going to believe you? There's a lot of fear and doubt and guilt for someone who wasn't even the perpetrator. They were the victim and the survivor of something that was really tough. So this is all they have. And I think being able to support them in that pursuit and just listening to them and trying to cheer them on and encourage them and see that courage is a really key thing for us.
I've seen a lot of victims that have had a hard time coming out, and I've even seen a few where like some victims have come out and then later on almost apologized for coming out with what happened. Not that it was a false or anything, but because so much drama gets stirred up. I just kind of want to hear what you guys think about like how can you support these people that are coming out? Because obviously this is like a very brave thing to do, and it can be very, very difficult to do. But as soon as like anything comes out about some of these very famous people, it's a shitstorm on the internet.
Yeah, my personal perception is a lot of times the people who have fought through this, they have their own individual support network. So you don't always want to initiate a conversation and say, yo, let's talk about this. Tell me the story. They may have already told it so many times that they're very sick of it. So the perception that I have is as an individual, you have your friends who you're really close with and stuff as well. And being able to find those opportunities for genuine conversation and support where they can really open up to you and they can really share the stuff that is hurting them the most. That's a thing that we can all have an awareness for and a sensitivity to as good friends of people around us. It's not just being friends of people because you like the jokes that they make when they're in a good mood, but also being able to pick them up when they're feeling really down and being able to accept their vulnerability and share in that with them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Neuro, especially like when it comes to a lot of times this stuff gets written off as drama. Like people think like, oh, you're just being dramatic or this is drama. I don't want to be a part of the drama. We hear that a lot of the time. But what is drama to some of us is emotional turmoil to the people who are going through it. And I think a lot of times people say things like, oh, I'm always here to talk, and then they aren't really, or they
It's
ask
like a
how you're
let's do
doing.
lunch.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, oh, if you need me, I'm here to talk. And I think some of it is important to, especially with those your loved ones and those people that are close to you to like check in and actually be willing to listen, which means when you offer, making sure that you're in a good place to do so. Because I think what happens to a lot of us is we make that offer but where we don't have like the emotional fortitude to handle something like that, maybe at that given point in time, and that's okay. But sometimes that can hurt someone's trust. Because I think we've all been in a situation where someone says, like, oh, yeah, I'm here if you need to talk. And you're like, actually, my mom has health problems right now. Things are really bad. And they're like, oh, sorry to hear that. And,
Mhm.
you hit this point where you're like, this is why I don't talk to people. And I think it's like, it's one of those things like, if you do make that offer, being sure that you're in a good place to make good on that offer and that it's not a hollow gesture. Cause I think sometimes we're all guilty of doing that.
Yeah, that connects to a broader point of compassion starting with yourself. If you're not taking good care of yourself, then you're not going to be in a sound state of mind to support other people because giving real support, especially when it comes to these difficult situations, it takes emotional energy from you. So you need to make sure that you have that energy to give to them. And that's going to start with a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the health episode, which is just being really well rested, having your own support network, being exercised, having a balanced diet, having a good work-life balance and all that, so that when that tough conversation comes up, you can really empathize with them. And empathizing with someone who's been through a very painful situation, it hurts because that's what empathy is. It's the other person's emotions and thoughts echoing within yourself in a way that allows you to have a genuine connection with them. That's tough stuff, and we need to be as prepared as we can be for that. So take care
Mm.
of yourself as well.
Sure, sure. The talking about the relationships with these people. So I feel like there's such a big range. There's people that maybe are friends or acquaintances of victims, and then there are people that are friends or acquaintances of perpetrators, and then there are, of course, I think the majority of people have kind of that the more one-way relationship where maybe they're this is their favorite commentator that they watch all the time, or maybe this is a streamer that they watch that has been abused or something like that. Uh, so I feel like there might be like a big range of how people can support, right? So, like, if you're a fan and the person doesn't know you, what type of support maybe can you give if someone comes out with a story of abuse? Like, are you supposed to tweet back at them? Are you supposed to like the tweet? Like, how can you kind of show support for someone in that way if you don't have like the direct line, right? If you're a popular streamer that comes out with something bad that happened, a lot of your fans can't just message you be like, "I'm here to talk." That's almost too much to have 20,000 people be like, "I'm here to talk," you know?
I think it's that same, like, saying, I hear you. I'm so sorry this happened to you.
Mm,
Because the reality is when a lot of people come out with these stories, I think it's that same fear. It requires a lot of bravery to come out with this. And the first thing you'll hear the naysayers say is that they're doing it for attention. And I'm just like, who wants that kind of attention?
that is the
I don't,
worst situation I could ever imagine in the whole world. That
right?
is
Like,
yeah.
who in the world wants everybody to know that this humiliating or dehumanizing thing happened to them, and who in the world wants that attention? I don't think anybody does. And so I think just showing support, saying, "That was really brave of you. Thank you for sharing your story." Things like that can be really helpful. And I think the other part of this is, if you know a streamer, or if you're friends with a streamer, or you watch a streamer that isn't implicated, I'm not saying like, oh, you have to go and crucify them right away, because that's where the focus falls into. I think it's not immediately rushing to their defense, because I forget where I heard this, but there's some statistic out there that's like, 1 in every 3 women has been sexually assaulted, but nobody knows a sexual assaulter, right? Like I love all my friends, but how well do I really know them? So just like I can't rush to their defense, I mean, I'm also not going to rush to believe, like, because that's what it turns into, right? It turns into this like, well, either you believe her or either you hate them. And it's like seeing a married couple you're friends with fight. You don't really know why they divorced. You might have some idea. You may have heard part of one person's side of the story, but you don't really know the whole picture. So just like you don't have to rush to defend someone, you don't have to rush to call someone a liar. I think it's really important to just be logical and be rational about this, and understand that some of the people you maybe don't know as well as you thought you did.
Yeah, for sure. That's for sure.
There's a personal element too in coming forward with a story that's worth mentioning. Whenever someone has something bad happen to them that was against their wishes, they're basically being forced into something, and there's a lot that's outside their control. And that situation gnaws at them over time. That's trauma. And by sharing the story is someone making a move on their own terms and taking control over that aspect of their life and their experiences. So that in and of itself, I think for them has a lot of positive value, where they're saying, this is what happened to me. I'm going to take a stand and really articulate this situation. It's nasty to talk about it. It's really tough, but having that quietly gnaw away at you and be alone is a lot worse.
Especially when you start to think about, like I think you were talking about it earlier, Neuro, that sometimes when it happens, you don't realize what just happened to you. We had this really great conversation right before we came on air, where we were talking about oftentimes like the reason, because that's one of the first questions that comes up, is people are like, well, this happened 3 years ago. Why are you just now talking? Some of that is when you see other people talking, it encourages you to talk. There's strength in numbers. And the other part of that is sometimes when it first happens, you yourself will be in denial. You'll say, oh, it wasn't that bad, or, oh, it wasn't a big deal, or, oh, I'm fine. And then time wears on and you still find yourself thinking about that thing or worrying about that thing. And for me, that was my first experience with racism. I was playing basketball in my driveway. And these kids who were way older than me were like, hey, can we play with you? And I was like, these kids are strangers. So I said no. And they were like, whatever, you fucking beaner. And I came inside and I asked my mom, I was like, what is that? And she's like, it's like a slur for Mexican people. And I was like, but I'm Indian. That was my reaction. It wasn't that like, wow, I was called a slur. It was like, but I'm Indian. That's stupid. Why would they call me a beaner? Like I had this entire, and it didn't take me until years later to realize like, wow, that was really messed up. They called like an 8-year-old, that word. Like that's really, but at the time I thought it was funny. I was like, wow, what a bunch of idiots. Like apparently we all just look the same like I thought it was funny for years. And then afterwards I was like, I should have thrown the basketball at him, but it took time for that to like simmer. Cause when it happened, I was just like, there's like a shock factor, and it doesn't always bother you right away. Sometimes it's that slow burn.
There are also some more subtle and partial forms of yikes or creepy situations that any instance on their own, it might not register as this is clearly bad. It could be like, this is kind of weird, or this is kind of awkward, but they'll go along with it a few steps, and then it gets worse and worse and worse to a point where if each of those steps was fairly minor, you could get to a really bad place and then realize it only when you're that far along. Because identifying a lot of the red flags leading up to it is pretty difficult, and it does require some training in your awareness, I think. There are a lot of tricks people can use to get you in a vulnerable situation and get you to do what they want. Basically, manipulation is what I'm talking about.
That seems to be a very common thing in a lot of the stories that that I've read on this movement that has been happening, that people are talking about that type of thing. Um,
Mhm.
uh,
So
uh,
basically, how do you identify that for yourself is a really important life skill. And I think for people sharing these stories, there are some people who have experienced maybe even the exact same stuff or certain elements that are similar. So the stories not only allow the person to take their own initiative in their life and take some control, but also to identify those lead up moves that perpetrators make and have an awareness of that when that happens to you in your own life.
mhm,
I think it also plays into like a lot of these stories are centered around like grooming and stuff like that, which in hindsight, you can see that and it seems really clear, but sometimes when it's happening, you don't notice the little tiny changes. So that's why stories like this are valuable because now it's like you said, it's about that awareness factor. Where if you see someone in your community or someone that's close to you slowly being distanced from their friends, starting to withdraw, being able to keep an eye out for that stuff, because I think like we're focusing on only one type of story, but if you look at these stories, they there's a whole range of different types of sort of atrocities that have happened. And I think sometimes we fall into that category of, well, it's not my business, or, it's not my place to say. But if you start to see someone slowly being removed from their support systems and you start to see them change as a person, I think it's important to keep an eye out for that because I think like none of us are looking for it. And so ultimately what we're left with is this feeling of guilt where it's like, wow, my friend went through that and I had no idea, or I just stopped talking to them because I thought they were being weird, or I thought they were a downer. And then you find out years later they were kind of suffering in silence. And so I think none of us like knows it unless we're looking for it.
yeah, it's like good tips for people that might see this type of behavior starting with friends. But what about the people that are starting this type of behavior and this is actually happening to them? Because like while a lot of stuff has come out, it feels like that can't be all, right? Most people still probably would be silent on it if I'm understanding these statistics correctly, where it's like 1 in 3 women have been assaulted or whatever, right? It's we certainly don't have that percentage of people reporting upon that. Uh, and the like for the victims, like is this something that everyone should be doing if something has happened to them? Is this the right call for everybody, or I'm
I don't
really
think
not
that's a
sure.
decision that should be made for them. That's a very personal thing. But if you look at historically speaking, this is not a thing that was talked about in the past at all, really. So it's unprecedented for us to be having these conversations now of people really getting into the details of the bad stuff that's happened to them. A lot of the historical approach and just historical and prehistorical oppression of women is just don't talk about it. And that's the thing. It's like talking about it is whining and it's complaining, and it's seen as a negative thing as opposed to a positive move to try to push for change and push for better treatment, which is what we're working on. And which is also why this conversation is so important to have, and also why it's kind of awkward and heavy and difficult to have. It's more fun to just pat each other on the back and say, everyone, you're doing a great job. This is an awesome scene. Keep it up. That feels
Mm,
good. You feel hyped up and charged up and all this. And we basically found out that a lot of damage has been done to people in the scene who we love. We really love and care about these people, and awful stuff has happened to them. That's going to put a bad taste in anyone's mouth.
mhm, that's for sure. It's been really kind of disgusting to watch. Um,
Yep.
you know, something we were talking about just before going live as well, is like the bravery to kind of like stand up as an observer of things going wrong or things going, I don't know, awry, in some of these situations where like maybe you see something, but it's like it's not necessarily happening to you. Wonder if you guys could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I was talking off air a little bit about how I used to have this podcast, which Neuro guested on a couple times. I know we had plans to have you on as well, Artosis, but with Jeff in Control TV, it was called the Deadpan Diaries. And one of the things he talked about was he was at an industry party and he witnessed like basically someone touch somebody inappropriately, and he froze. And it's really weird to think of Jeff that way, because he's just so brave, and like, he's twice the person most of us are. And so
Yeah.
the idea that somebody like that could freeze in that situation, he said that in retrospect he had a lot of guilt about it, and he went over that situation over and over again in his head, like what should he have done, or how could he have handled that better. And he said at the time, like, his focus was on, like, checking in with his friend, making sure she was okay, but he wished he had kept that dude accountable. And I think it's one of those things where it's like, you have to remember that you're not the harasser. And so I feel like I feel like I drove us off track a little bit with the idea of like, being afraid to come forward or being afraid to speak up when it happens. But I think a lot of us aren't trained on how to deal with that situation, right? We feel like we might be escalating, or we feel like we might be jumping into something that isn't our business. But on the other hand, it is our business, and we should say something. Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel like we all think about what we would do in that situation, but then when
Yeah.
the situation occurs, some of us, we don't know what to do in that situation.
A lot of this, it connects with the overall like discovery that the world has a lot more evil in it than you may have thought when you were a child. If you think about the current year, the world as a game, I think when you're a kid, you're pretty sheltered from a lot of stuff. At least I had a pretty sheltered upbringing. You don't see a lot of the backstabbing, the abuse, the evil, the thing that people do in private situations behind closed doors that's really bad. And sometimes when you see it for the first time, like I realized this when I was building my first sandcastle as a kid and someone came over and stomped all over it. I just didn't even understand why someone would wreck something or destroy something that was good and cool. Like, why would you even do that? I wasn't mad initially. I was just confused. So a lot of this sort of behavior, when you see it, your brain is also just trying to process, like, what is the motivation here? Like, what is the game plan? Because this is a really evil choice. And I am confused. And I think that's where a lot of the freeze comes from, is you're trying to understand why and you can't. And sometimes you only discover, like you were saying, after the fact, maybe what you would have liked to say. Okay, maybe in that situation, I should have done this. And you do feel bad if you miss an opportunity to stand up for someone. And that's unfortunate, but everyone makes mistakes. Everyone meets new situations that they don't know how to respond to the first time. But you have an opportunity for the next time to do a little better if you can.
Yeah, I wonder if there's like, I bet you there's some sort of resource out there that would be like a best practices for things like this. Because honestly, I'm not really sure what would that look like if I was at some sort of party, and it's like I have no idea. So I mean, maybe there's something out there for people where they can kind of take a look and be like, oh, in this type of situation, yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily want to escalate, but you want to make sure that, everyone's okay or something like that. I don't know.
I have a website that I recommended in the group chat. I think I sent it to Cobra as well. Loveisrespect.org. Can I link that in the Twitch chat?
Oh, go ahead.
Basically, this is a site with a bunch of resources recommended by the National Domestic Violence Hotline here in the United States. It talks about a lot of good practices for communication, talks about what consent is and is not, uh, different ways that you can just be a good partner to someone else or be a friend who's supportive and a good listener and things like that. The title itself of the site, I think, is really important too, in just articulating, as the meme song we've heard before, what is love? What does love mean? Because I think there's some misconceptions about love being more possessive than it should be. Respecting other people means seeing their individuality as a person in the world with their own beliefs, desires, ambitions, and goals, and how that narrative is unfolding, and really trying to help them live their best life, to be the best version of themselves. Not that they're someone who you want to have with you at all costs, but as someone who you truly see who they are and you see the path before them and you want to make them live their best life if you can. You want to cheer them on, teach them what you can, love them, listen to them, support them. and help them be the rock star of their own life.
Yeah. Um, I want to for a moment because like I feel like this part of it is kind of a sticky part. This part that I do want to bring up briefly here because obviously the focus should be more on the victims and everything. But this whole innocent until proven guilty thing, because I've seen a lot of people throwing that back and forth in some arguments about some of these things coming out. Um, and obviously, like, we should mention about how false allegations, they hurt the movement themselves. You don't wanna, like, discount everything because maybe there's one that's false or something. But I've also noticed, I know that this is getting kind of big as I say it, but, like, uh, there's a large set of people who have been accused of things within, the esports scene that just haven't responded. They just go completely dark on the internet, and I wonder how you guys look at that. Is that just, like, an admission of guilt? Is that, like how are you supposed to look at that if people have a bunch of things coming out about them and just don't respond?
That I'm gonna say something, and I don't think it's the popular take,
Okay.
but a lot of people say that's people getting their story together. But to me, what it is a lot of times when people first put an apology out there, the first thing the internet does is tear apart why that apology is bad or why that apology is stupid or why they shouldn't have posted that. So I think it is important maybe to take a step back and do some maybe introspection, because a lot of times these are cases where people don't see the situation the same way that the other person does. A lot of times this isn't as clear cut as we think it is, and I'm not saying that, oh, anybody's lying. I'm just saying there's every possibility in the world that you and I can both walk away from a situation or a conversation, and I can say that conversation went really well and you could say that conversation went very poorly. So it's one of those things where it's like it's a lot of times people that engage in crappy behavior or shitty behavior don't realize that they've engaged in crappy behavior or shitty behavior until they're called out on that. And I'm not saying that ignorance excuses what they did, but I do think it's okay to take a step back and think about that memory and I'm not saying this is the case in every case, because some of these are really clear-cut cases of sexual assault. But for some of these where consent is blurry, I think it's important for people to step back and think about what happened, what didn't happen, think about why they did that, why they thought it was appropriate, and whether or not they think, how they should apologize. Because the reality is a lot of people are really bad at apologizing. And the Twitter and the internet is also very picky about what they want in an apology. And I understand why, because you get so many phony apologies that are just people's desperate attempt to get their clout back and get their platform back. And it's so clear they're not really sorry for what they did. But then you also get other people that when I read their apologies, I don't necessarily think they're bad apologies. I just think they were bad at writing them.
Mm.
So I don't always think silence is an admission of guilt, but that's just me.
I think it raises a good question there of what is a good apology? Being able to apologize well means to really connect with the offense that you actually made, to be able to articulate it and put that in your own words in a way that indicates that you understand what you did wrong. But then the really, really, really difficult part after that is actually changing your behavior moving forward. And that's the thing that you can't see in a tweet. That's something that would have to be represented in their behavior from there on out. And that's tough. So not only do people need to fess up and basically articulate the wrongdoings, but to see what that pattern behavior was and try to get to the root cause of what caused them to think that way, what caused them to treat other people in that way, and how they should be treating people instead. What is the right way to treat another person? They need to evaluate that. And it is kind of tricky in that sometimes people not admitting guilt means they get less punished than someone who makes an apology. That's rough to see. Sometimes you'll see someone who admits something and they get banned for it, and then someone who doesn't admit it and they don't. So which is the right way in that case? I think for the process of having your own personal story arc of being a good person, it's worth coming forward with the mistakes that you made. It's going to be hard in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to end up being a better person over the course of your life.
Yeah, that is for sure.
I think almost about goodness and being upfront and honest, and sometimes confrontational when it comes to tackling the tough things, like working out, where you're basically front loading the pain and the discomfort. You're just getting it out of the way right at the start so that you're going to be stronger in the future. Having this conversation is that kind of category as well, where this is something that is a tough exercise for us and for the chat and for all the communities that are discussing this right now. It's difficult, but we will come out of all of this stronger with more knowledge and awareness, and hopefully with better skills and approaches for treating each other positively.
Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of people that have been kind of outed and then apologize and stuff. Well, the thing is, there's such a range, so I guess it's hard to like pinpoint exactly, like, because some people are like, "Oh, the events weren't exactly like this." There's some people that are just like, "I am so sorry." There's some people that don't respond. There's some people that are somewhere in between all of these things, right? But I guess one thing that you can see is people who are getting accused, for the most part, are basically out of a job, right? Like, I think that most everyone is like, okay, well, you're not doing this anymore. Like, the companies are breaking ties with them. They're not doing their thing anymore. Is this like a good way to handle it? Like, does that help the abused? Right? Like, I mean, if you're someone who wants to still participate within the community, it would probably be good to have that person gone, or I'm not sure.
I think there should at least be a break.
Mm,
Like I think like if I it's weird because one of the mental aspects of this is someone has wronged you and then you have to watch them be successful and you have to occupy the same space as them. And a lot of times that's really difficult. Um and so I don't think a period of absence is a bad thing.
mhm,
Um I think sometimes people need time to step away and work on themselves, especially because with the nature of what we do, you constantly have people validating every decision you make. With the nature of Twitch and YouTube and streaming, it's a very parasocial relationship. And so I try to remind my audience because they'll always say like, "Well, Bronze, you're a good person," and I always say, "Do you really know that? Like you see me the way I am on air, but you don't know if I turn off the camera and go kick my dog and backhand my significant other. You don't see that part of me. You're seeing what I choose to show you, and you're using that to make essentially a character judgment that you don't really have any grounds to make." And so I think sometimes and this is just my personal theory, I think sometimes content creators get it in their head where they're like, "Well, I'm a good person. This other person told me they were depressed and they watched my stream and that I got them through a tough time. And I've raised so much money for St. Jude's and all this money for charity. And I'm a good person." But it's important to remember that good is something you do, not something that you are. And so being removed from that effect of having a gigantic platform that does nothing but validate who you are as a person, your morality, or tell you constantly that you're a good person, they forgive you. What's your incentive to then go and think about what you did or work on yourself if you have thousands of people every day who just basically verbally give you a hand job and tell you that you're great at everything you do? So yeah, it's one of those things where it's like the parasocial relationship or nature of social media makes it to where people are constantly telling you. I'm sure they do it to you too as well. Where, "Oh, you're a good person." It's like, but how do you really know that? You only see me for X amount of hours a day, and you're only seeing what I choose to show you. You might have some indication based off of how I carry myself online, but as evidenced, a lot of these people were very outspoken, like social justice people, constantly talking about respecting women, and then in DMs they were doing the complete opposite of that.
mm,
I would say that with the live streamer or content creator, say YouTube and things like that, being a host, commentator, it's a very public facing in the spotlight kind of job. And people watching you is its own accountability mechanism because you realize that everything that you're doing is being recorded and put on display. So you better not mess it up. But when people are anonymous or private or in a one on one situation, sometimes they behave very differently because they feel like they can get away with stuff. So you should be really careful about a content creator or public person's persona, their image, how they behave when they're on stage and doing their thing versus the content of their character. Those are not always the same thing. Sometimes people have a persona that's different from themselves to some extent. So you can't really make that overall judgment call of this is a good person or this is a bad person. You can see actions, you can see behaviors and words and conduct, and you can weigh those. You can say whether this is good or bad. But I mean, you're basically the only person who knows everything that you've done, more or less, except for when you're really drunk and you can't remember what you're doing.
And that is maybe part of the problem that we've seen going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah. About the people accused, the kind of a follow-up to that, because a lot of them are having to take kind of a forced break in a lot of ways. Do you think that the community should eventually let people back in, like welcome people back after some sort of amount of time or some sort of change of heart? But like as you said, Bronze, you can't really tell what from watching someone. Like, has there actually been a change here? Right? It's like people show what they want you to see, and you can't really. It's like, do you know if I'm a good person? It's like, well, probably not, right?
Yeah, Chad has made a good point. Being drunk is not an excuse. I wasn't trying to say that it was. You are still fully responsible for all of your actions, no matter how coherent you are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's a complicated question. Especially because we're so new to this, it hasn't come up yet. You know,
Yeah,
like we haven't had a situation where someone was, removed from the community and 8 years have passed and they've tried to make a return. But we have had some situations on the Twitch side where someone was accused of something, and they just deleted all their tweets, went quiet for a period of between 4 to 8 months and came back. I won't name names, but some of the names that were brought up a second time with this Me Too movement were brought up about a year ago, and they
Oh, wow.
kind of just quietly brushed it under the carpet and then came back. People that were accused of doing bad things to their spouses and stuff like that, and they just stayed quiet for a year and kind of quietly lurked back. I think that's BS. I think trying to hide and rebrand yourself and come back is nonsense. I think accountability is an important part of it, but I'm not one of the victims. So I don't know if I can say that if I would ever be at a point in time where I would be okay working with these people again. And I think that's where a lot of people's sort of conundrum is that the nature of our jobs is such that we work with each other. And would you want to share a caster's desk or something like that with someone that has wronged you in that way? And in that case, who is it more important to make feel comfortable? But a lot of this comes down to people starting to get into the nitty gritty of like, well, does the punishment fit the crime?
Mhm.
And the reality is the severity of some of these, like it differs. And I don't know if I can speak to that. I don't know if I can sit here and determine what an adequate punishment is, depending on what some of these people have done.
Yeah. Well said.
And there are different extents of offenses, so there should be ideally different levels of punishment too. So some of the stories are very extreme, some of them are more minor, and for them to be treated exactly the same seems a little bit unfair. But as people have said in the chat, we're not judges. This is not an official court of law. We're just people trying to understand what's going on and try to find the best way forward.
And I mean,
Yeah.
that becomes a pitfall too, though, right? Because it's like when these stories come out, there are some that are just like, wow, this person is just an awful human being. And I think it tends to like desensitize you. So the last thing I want to do is minimize or try to say, well, this person's story isn't as important or this isn't as bad, because I think the risk for that is also there. Because these stories, like you said, range the whole, like, well, this just seems like it was a misunderstanding, and this seems like it was like, abuse over several years. And so that becomes part of it, about why people don't speak up, because it's like, well, my story isn't as bad as that one. It's like, yeah, but that person also still did something wrong, and you have every right to be upset about that. So this is like a multi-headed hydra in some ways, and finding an answer to these questions is going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even think of some way to do it because there's no like one governing body or anything. I mean, the thing is the public opinion sways everything so heavily anyways that it seems like right now basically if you've done something you're kind of done for now. Like that seems to be the way. I don't really see anyone that's not being, basically kicked out of events and banned from things and all those things that has been accused and is admitted to it at least. Um, there should be like something that we can do as a community within esports, within StarCraft, within everything. Like how do we go forward in this type of situation? Because like you said, I think this isn't it isn't done yet. Like there's going to be more stuff coming out. It seems like, esports really kind of kicked off like about 10 years ago or so. So, and we've seen like a huge range of things within that time period, and that is a big chunk of time. So obviously more is going to be coming up, but how do we like improve things so that this isn't happening in the future? Because I mean, obviously this is a terrible thing we don't want. The mistakes that we should at least be able to learn from what's going on, like best practices, or like is there a certain way that we can make the future brighter from this?
There's a magical word that's not as understood as it should be, and that's consent. Consent is super, super important for not just doing sexual, intimate stuff with someone, but also how you communicate with them and being very clear about what people are comfortable with or uncomfortable with every step of the way. And uh, to go back to the concept of different states of mind, you should be able to identify like what consent really is. A lot of people don't realize that if someone is really drunk and they're not in their best state of mind, they can't really give you proper consent, which means that you should basically not mess with them. Sometimes people will basically look for whoever is vulnerable at a party and they will kind of pursue that person when they're not as together as they would normally be. Don't do that. You should be able to be on the same page and really connect with someone and try to figure out not just what you want, but also what they want, and to be able to bridge that gap and have fun together. And sometimes that means being able to take a no and take that like a boss and respect the person's space and move on. Being tenacious and pursuing someone is a really scary situation for the recipient to be in. So, for you to be flexible and you to be patient and be able to say, okay, this person is not into this, they're not interested, I'm going to look for another opportunity and keep to myself. It's a really big move that doesn't really get that much praise. Oftentimes, when you get a no, you feel bad. Like you feel like maybe you weren't good looking enough, or you're not charismatic enough, or not funny enough. But maybe you're just not their type, and that's okay. And you will have opportunities in the future. And being able to like take those no's and be patient means that you may find someone who's way more amazing and a way better fit for you in the future. Hang in there. I know people they're lonely. Loneliness is a really big issue right now, but don't be in a rush. If you're patient, you'll be rewarded with someone who is really into you and wants to be with you.
Mhm.
I think that was a really good point. And I think the other part of this is changing some of the culture around how our industry operates. And some of that is, I think the most like recurrent theme I've seen with all of these stories is, let's be real, a lot of these dudes know that they don't have a chance with these people, which is why they don't approach them directly, right? They don't just shoot their shot and then get shut down. No, they dangle an industry contact. They make it seem like it's business. Oh, hey, I would love to collaborate with you on this podcast. Or, oh, hey, I have X amount of followers, or I work for, X game company, and I would love to get you on our press list. They are not approaching these people with anything other than business in mind, and then they get creepy really quick. And what upsets me about that is they know if they were to go and ask that person out, they would get a no. So they don't do that. They go and they approach them with a business contact or with a business thing, and then they insert that in there. And of course, like when you're leveraging your power or your position or your clout in an industry, that's going to make the other person feel intimidated, because now you're coming after their career or you're damaging their career. And I feel like if you're going to approach someone and try to make a pass at them, you should probably do that in a direct fashion and not under the auspices of offering them something from a business perspective, because they might give you their contact information thinking to themselves, this is a business interaction. I'm networking, or I'm trying to create opportunities for myself. And you're sitting here thinking, she's into me. But the reality is this is false advertisement. You did not approach her with the intent of dating her. You approached her with the intent of some type of business partnership, and now you're changing the terms halfway into the deal. And that has to stop, because that happens in this industry so much. People will approach you and try to get your business card, claiming that, they'd like to collaborate. And then, they get weird as soon as they find out that, you're not single or that you're not interested. And now you've jebaited them. But really, the reality is they jebaited you, because they acted like they were networking, but really they were trying to date.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. I do want to bring up, like, gaming is much bigger now, and in streaming and all this, than it ever was. But is this just the overall kind of gaming community, the Twitch community, the esports community? We're kind of going gaming and then Twitch and then esports, and it gets smaller and smaller, right? But I've been around within it for like 22 years or so, and it's like I think on average, people have maybe less self-confidence. They're a little bit more awkward people, more introverts and stuff involved. Are we more liable to this type of thing because of that? Or is that something like, because yeah, some of these things, especially some of these stories, are like, oh, I just thought it was an awkward guy, and it's like, well, there are quite a few awkward people within this industry, within this scene. So, I wonder if you have any takes on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of social skills and things that we can develop as a community. One of the things that inspired me to be a StarCraft streamer and do a road to GM was seeing a lot of the bad mindset that people were representing, even among the pro scene, of not taking responsibility for their mistakes. And I think being able to have those conversations, it's kind of like for every community, they need to figure it out for themselves. Being able to put these concepts into their own words based on their own interactions and their own experiences, rather than just echoing something that another community over here was saying. This needs to be our conversation that we have, where we all learn about how to approach this together and we learn moving forward. There is the stereotype that gamers are more introverted and that kind of thing. And I think there is something to be said about that. And also, there's the behavior of the like thirsty person at a convention that is worth addressing. I think people have desires, right? People find others attractive. Being able to go about that in a way that doesn't make other people feel uncomfortable is a really important skill and point of awareness for yourself. You might think someone is pretty. It doesn't mean that you should follow them around. In fact, that's really creepy and weird. Stop doing that. The people who you'll see get the most attention are the people who are at ease with themselves. They're at peace. They can just stand and have a conversation. They're not actively needing to pursue whatever pretty person. They're at the convention having fun, focusing on whatever the events are and that kind of thing. So think about the impression and it's like an aura that you give off socially speaking. Do people feel safer when you're in that situation, or do they feel more cautious and more scared and concerned? Because there are a lot of people when they enter into a social situation, people get uncomfortable. Try to be aware of that in yourself.
Yeah, and to piggyback off your point, one of the things you hear people say a lot is like, "Oh, wow, I could never get girls to talk to me, but as soon as I put on an engagement ring or a wedding ring, or when I'm out with, with my female friends, I get hit on all the time." And some of that is like having approval from other women that you're not a weirdo is sometimes the best cosign you can get. And it's funny because dudes, I feel like, always shy away from that. Like, oh, I'm in the friend zone. Oh, that's the worst. I'm like, you're an idiot, is what you are. Because if other women see that other girls hang out with you and think you're cool and find value in you, they are more likely to talk to you. And I don't know why this is lost on so many people, where they're just like, well, no, no, no. This really hot girl that I really like and is really well spoken, she put me in the friend zone. And it's like, you realize when people see you talking to her and hanging out with her and that she thinks you're cool, they're going to be like, what's it about this guy that is so awesome that all these, like, awesome women hang out with him? It makes you look less like a freaking weirdo. And I think people get so fixated, or they feel like they're owed, like sexual intercourse. Like, well, no, I've put in the time and I've put in the work. And I think some of this is being honest with your own desires. And I think this is coming up more and more, like in the gaming community, is people are not honest with why they're pursuing why they're talking to someone. And I think sometimes they probably, they get lost in the sauce themselves. Like, well, no, 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 I want to work with this person. Do you really? Or are you working with them with the intent that down the line, you're going to date them? Because now you've created this nonverbal contract that the other party did not agree to. They are working with you thinking that this is a strictly professional situation, and you are making persistent advances over the course of 8 months, slowly getting more bitter and more aggressive and more persistent, because in your mind, you are owed this thing. And the reality is when you entered into this, you needed to be honest with your own desires, and you had to make those clear to everybody, including yourself. Otherwise, you're not being fair to anybody in that situation.
Yeah, the friend zone is also a rustling concept to me in general, because it makes friendship seem like it's a bad thing. And friendship is one of the most wonderful parts of the human experience. So for you to be a friend of another person who exists in the world is fantastic. And you're saying that that's bad because you also want to sleep with the person. That's pretty fucked up, just straight up. So for you to be attracted to someone and for them not to reciprocate happens. Them's the ropes. Deal with it. Move on. Be the friend that they need you to be if friendship is something that you can both agree on. Don't be the creep who's trying to always like twist them or steer them in a direction of a romantic relationship if they've clearly stated they don't want to. Too bad.
Yeah,
you can
and
be
if they
sad for a little bit.
I think it's, once again, it comes back to that, like, being in touch with your own desires, right? Because I think sometimes people will pursue the friendship, but they're bitter about it. So if you're in touch with your emotions and you're like, this rejection hurts too much, or I think it's too soon. Maybe when they say, well, maybe we could just be friends, say maybe down the line. I can't do that right now. But the reality is most people take that as a soft maybe, which is like, well, she doesn't want to date me right now, but I'll be her friend once again in the hopes that down the line, I'm not going to be her friend anymore. She might think you're just her friend. So if you're really just there to pursue the relationship, if you have no interest in being someone's friend beyond currying their favor to date them down the line, what are you doing to yourself? Be nice to yourself. Why are you hanging out with someone when it's killing you to watch them date other people? Clearly, you're too close to this. Clearly, you're too attached. The best thing you could do is have distance. The last thing you should do is continue to put yourself in close proximity with this person and then be bitter that you're not getting this sex that you're owed. Why are you doing that to yourself? Stop hating yourself.
Very, very good tips and good points from you guys on that. To kind of transition that into the online perspective too, because that's something we saw a lot of, right? We've been talking in the last couple minutes more about like people that you actually know in real life, maybe you see them at conventions, that type of thing. And that has definitely been a big, big part of the complaints that have come out from victims and whatnot. But there's also the online thing where it's like these two people don't even live near each other, but there can be all sorts of weird harassment and crazy things going on with that as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of the online discourse is tricky because you miss much of the nuance of people's facial expressions and their bearing and their tone. So there's its own like skill set that you have to develop for being able to communicate and also to be able to listen and understand where other people are coming from. A lot of the harassment and abuse I think that happens is largely based on people not taking the time to think about what the other person wants and to be able to find that mutual common ground. Like the meme is someone wants to see nudes of another person, so they send that person nudes of themselves, thinking that that's a good opener, when really maybe that's not what they're into, and that can be really gross and violating for them to receive without context and without consent. So you should really have, I think if you care about someone and maybe you have that little spark of you're romantically interested, you should try to understand their perspective and their desires and their goals, not just yours, and trying to have them fit into your own narrative. Some people think about a partner like it's in one of the slots on your character sheet where I have my weapons, I have my armor, and I have my pet, I have my partner, I have all these different things, I have my house, my car, and they want to fit that narrative together. But when you really have a genuine partnership with someone, it becomes a shared narrative. And you need to understand not just where they're coming from, but also where they want to go. That's very complex and very difficult and requires a lot of real conversation with the person. And it takes a lot of time too. So if you want that to be genuinely awesome, you're going to have to be patient and you're going to have to work through it. And you're also going to find out that that person is not just the dream partner for yourself that maybe you thought up when you were on a train ride someday. They're a person that has some flaws. They have some quirks and some uniqueness about them. And if you want to love them and if you want them to love you, you have to accept those and you have to love them for how they are.
I think it's also important to note that people move at different speeds. So the rate at which, you're ready to take your relationship, your online relationship to the next level, might not be where someone else is at. And, one of the main things about consent is that it should always be enthusiastic. So if you find yourself, because a lot of these cases is people just not really taking no for an answer and then being like, well, this person, she sent me these photos. Yeah, my guy, because you asked her repeatedly over the course of 8 months and you wouldn't stop, and she likes you and she felt pressured. And the reality is if she wanted to send them to you, she would have sent them on the second or the third ask, right? Like, and on some level, like, I think sometimes we get so obsessed with wanting something or desiring something, we remove accountability from that, which is that if you really love someone, if you really like someone, or you care about someone, why are you emotionally manipulating, emotionally blackmailing, and pressuring them to do something they don't want to do? That part of it has to be on you. When you engage in any kind of physical or online exchange of sexting, whatever the kids are calling it these days, why wouldn't you want the other person involved to be in it 100%? At that point, you need to do some checking in with yourself. Of why you're okay with pressuring someone to the point that they give in versus them saying, yeah, let's do this, because that should be your goal. Consent should always be enthusiastic.
Yeah, and it also fits with the lining up of consent with the dating aspect of being out at an event or out in your personal life and you meet someone and maybe they don't line up with you. Sometimes you can get a few steps along and your desires don't end up lining up. And that's something you have to be prepared for as well. Sometimes the other person is not into the stuff that you're into. You have to accept that. That's just one of the elements of uniqueness of every given person, is not everyone is into the same stuff, which means you need to respect those boundaries and those decisions for themselves and not arm twist them into doing the stuff that you want to do. Being able to share your desires is fine if they're consenting to that kind of conversation, but pressuring them and directing them against their will is definitely not okay.
Also, if you are lucky enough that a girl sends you a hot photo, don't freaking share that with your friends. You are literally ruining it for all the dudes out there right now, okay? I want you to know that the reason that people don't send them is because you're freaking, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Stop that. You're ruining it for everybody. So if you have a friend that's like, hey, want to see this girl's nudes? Check them on that. Be like, you know what? You're the reason I don't get to see titties in my inbox anymore. Knock that shit off.
Things that should be common sense but are not.
Yes, indeed. I'm trying to think if there's stuff that we've missed here. I've kind of gone through the list I wrote up before the show. Is there anything that kind of I'm missing bringing up? There must be something.
There was a story that I wanted to tell actually that really shifted my perception of what love was. I mentioned this in the Discord before we got started. But I had a university professor who really changed my perspective and a lot of other students who were there about what love is. And basically, I mentioned this earlier in the discussion as well. We're conditioned a lot of times to really think that it's about pursuit against all odds and pursuit even if the other person isn't in a place to receive us, when patience and having that even keel where you see the other person, you see where they're going in their own story arc, and it's kind of like letting a bird fly freely or letting an animal just be free in nature. Sometimes it's not correct for you to think that they need to be next to you all the time. You need to be able to observe their like story arc as an individual to see, is what we're doing together healthy and productive for both of us? Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's an imbalanced relationship as well, where the other person is pouring a lot more of their heart, soul, and energy into it than you are, and they're not getting out what they deserve. A relationship like a friendship should be equitable, more or less, where you're both contributing majorly to it over time. If it's too far skewed in one direction, where one person is benefiting way more than the other person, that's not fair. And that's going to weigh on them. And it feels more like a burden than it does like a bond. So that's something you should be mindful of too for friendships with your community and with your friends, and then also partnerships too, is what am I bringing to the table? How am I supporting and loving this person and lifting them up, empowering and encouraging them to kick ass and live their best life?
I think that the vision that you're trying to dispel here is like movies just kind of ruin people's perception of things. Like if you go look at all the romantic movies and things where it's like the guy just pursues this girl that's not interested the whole time and then eventually wins her at the end and you're like, yeah, that's, it's kind of, all sorts of movies are like the Rocky movies, right? It's like it shows this 1 minute cut scene of him training and then he's the world champion. And it's like, no. This both of these are very inaccurate and are giving people all sorts of the wrong ideas of the way the world actually works.
Yeah, I want to push masters. What do? You just need a 15-minute video montage of you punching a bag and doing some practice, and then you'll be there.
Never gonna happen that way.
If movies and stuff were true. But yeah, a lot of movies and literature really portray the wrong idea. So some of this is people who I think have been conditioned with some pretty bad concepts for what healthy practices are, and being able to identify that as a systemic issue rather than just a personal issue, that we have been given some bad information and that we are also heavily lacking in education on these kinds of topics. Since love and relationships are one of the things that is universally human, you would think that we would learn about this in school to an extent. You would think that we would understand what consent is in middle school or high school or something, rather than talking about it now or talking about it in some university course. You would think that figuring out what abuse is and what the red flags for it are would be taught to children, because children can be abused. And sometimes they're abused and they don't have the words to describe it. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us for figuring this out, not just for ourselves, but for future generations, so they don't make the same mistakes that we did.
Yeah. And some of this also falls into like, when we start talking about slut shaming and stuff like that, right? This is something that no woman ever wants to be branded as like a thought or a slut. And so you do have this phenomenon where people feel like they have to play hard to get. You know, they might want to say yes or they might want to consent, but they feel like they have to say no because, you know, if they give it up on the first date, then what are you going to think of them? And so a lot of people look at that as like, oh, that's just SJW shit. And it's like, if a woman wants to sleep with you and you're engaging in behaviors that make them not want to sleep with you, are you not just shooting yourself in the foot? I'm just trying to get this right in my head. So if a woman like sleeps with you on the first date and your first impression is, well, okay, clearly she's a thotty, I can't put a ring on that, you're kind of ruining it for yourself in some ways. And it's like the great hypocrisy of our society, right? Like on one hand, we have this idea of what is marriage material, and then we have this idea of what is not marriage material, but then all of you dudes are trying to get laid all the time. And it's like, are you not seeing the issue here? Because there's these two forces are opposing each other. On one hand, you want women that don't give it up because they're the good girls, but then on the other hand, you want to get your dick sucked. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know how this is going to be accomplished on a universal scale. Sorry.
Basically, you've described Instagram comments where the same person is saying, show more of yourself, and you're showing too much of yourself at the same time.
It's weird. And I understand there's a lot of different sexualities that exist, you know? And so I'm what is called demisexual. So the idea of having sex with a stranger completely disgusts me. And I don't like talking about it. So you can imagine how difficult this podcast is for me. But it's one of those things where it's like, I view it from like a third person perspective where I don't look down on people who are a little bit more, you know, liberal with their physical love. But I see people who are, and they look down on them. And I'm just like, it's really strange to me that so many people spend so much of their time hating the same women that they would probably do anything to be with. And it's like, it just seems counterproductive to me.
Yeah.
It's because it is.
Certainly, it's there's not a lot of logic going on, I think, with a lot of these things. I wonder, right? Because I almost feel really lucky in a way. Like, well, obviously, you know, I am a lucky person, everything, but I look at this and I just wonder if some of these people need to seek help, like professional help. For instance, some of these predators, obviously some of the victims might need something like that as well. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that or that even needs to be addressed, but I guess some of the people, it feels like it's been such a serial thing that's gone on that it's like, ooh, there's something deeper here, maybe.
That's a really good point, and I can't believe I forgot that. But one of the things that's on the website and one of the main points of contact for Love is Respect and the hotline is not just talking to survivors, but also talking to abusers, because some abusers are doing what they've seen done around them. So an example would be someone who grows up in a home where the parents had an abusive relationship and they get into a relationship, and that's the example that they have to work from of what a relationship is like. They haven't seen alternatives, really. So to have those conversations is something that is really important too, to get your bearings and figure out what good behavior is, what being a good partner is all about. Because some people who are abusing have also been abused themselves, and they need support too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can definitely be a victim and an abuser. A person can be capable of both. And I think the other part of this is acknowledging that ignorance of something doesn't absolve you from doing it. So a lot of times when people engage in these behaviors of gaslighting or being awful to their partner over a period of years, and then it comes out and the entire internet is like, wow, I can't believe you did that. You're, a terrible human being. A lot of times with these apologies and the responses we get, they focus on the fact that they didn't know. And it's like, well, that's where, maybe some type of mental health or therapy or counseling is needed, because sometimes we don't know. And that doesn't make it okay. It makes it to where when things are brought to your attention, you have to be willing to have that conversation. You have to be willing to hold yourself accountable, and you have to be willing to be introspective enough to realize that just because you didn't know you were doing something makes it okay. It's very important to correct the behavior. And like Neuro was saying, oftentimes like we reflect the behavior that we see in the relationships in our household. It can go either way. If you grow up in a household where everyone yells at each other, maybe you don't think it's a big deal to yell at your partner, or maybe you don't think it's a big deal to scream at people. Sometimes it goes the other way. If you're in a household where people yell at each other, maybe you can't handle people yelling at you. And so if I'm yelling and my partner cannot handle it, I might think it's not a big deal, and they might think it might be breaking their psyche. It might be very mentally abusive and emotionally abusive to them. And so this is one of those things where having a conversation about it, being open about it, and having good conversational skills in your toolbox is very important, because these things take work. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes understanding how to communicate effectively, how to be emotionally intelligent is the word I would use, to understand why you're feeling what you're feeling and how to convey that in a way that is not destructive. And these things take time and effort.
There was a line on the Love is Respect site that jumped out at me that is worth mentioning, especially in 2020. And that is active listening, where you are fully focused on the conversation and the person. This is the year of multitasking, and we have phones, multiple monitors. There's so much stuff happening around us that sometimes we don't give the person our 100% attention. And if it's a serious topic like this, that matters a whole lot, to really connect with not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it. Being fully present. It's kind of like the samurai concept that I have on Tuesdays of, you're going to be performing your best when you have the least amount of distractions. In this context of healthy relationships, you're going to be the best possible listener when you only have that person to listen to.
Yeah, put the phone away, guys. Like that's
Yep.
that's a lesson for every aspect of life at this point, is put that phone away, and you can actually give people attention rather than glancing down at it all the time. It's crazy. Put it in your backpack or whatever.
Mhm.
I had something actually that I wanted to ask. Hold on. It'll come back to me. Oh, it completely left my brain. I'm sorry. I'm sure it'll come back as soon as we talk about something else. But oh yeah, okay, here it is. So we kind of hit on this a little bit earlier, where it was talked about where like people maybe get tired of this a little bit. Bronze, you were talking about it, and how it's all negative and everything. But at the same time, I felt like reading all these, because I've kind of been reading, across multiple esports communities, and reading a lot of the stories and a lot of the responses and things like this. It started to become, it felt like mentally unhealthy as well, though. Like I felt like I needed a break, where it was like, this is too much. This is too heavy. I'm getting depressed. I'm feeling really sad. Last week was like a very sad week, I think, for anyone that loves esports and cares about esports, and the people who also love it. This is supposed to be a place where you are connecting with people that are like you. I know for me, that was as a kid growing up in a small town in New Hampshire that had no one that was like me at all. Esports was kind of my saving grace, where I found all my friends and like found my career and how I could express myself and have a good time. And so to kind of see that move from that into this, where it's this huge amount of negativity and terrible things happening to people, and reading about all that, it's been really depressing for the past, week plus, where at the same time I'm trying to keep up and read and realize what's going on and think about it. But yeah, it's so downing. I don't really even have a question. It's kind of more of a statement that I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on, I guess.
Yeah, it's heavy for everyone. A lot of times you are a fan of someone, you love their work that they do, their content, their commentary, casting, what have you. and then you find out that they've done some really bad stuff. And that's rough because that means that the world that you perceive is darker than you thought in terms of people's behavior and actions. And it's not fun. It's not fun to hear about. A lot of people, they would prefer to avoid that, kind of live in their happy cloud of all these people, they're great and no one's done anything wrong. But that's not the real case. There are some bad things that have happened, and for this to come to light means that we can now be more honest with each other. And that's the positive through the pain.
Yeah.
I think it's also I don't think it's necessarily wrong to disengage or to gauge that, like, you know, you have to put your mask on first, you know what they say, like, before you put it on anybody else. And the reality is 2020 has been a doozy for a lot of us. And I think as long as you disengage with the intent of coming back and not turning, you know, away from these issues, I don't think it's wrong to take a break. You know, one of the big things I say is the first thing when you wake up in the morning, you should not be checking Twitter. Like, you need to do something for yourself when you wake up, whether that's taking a few minutes to stretch, get in a little cardio, make yourself a cup of tea. But the reality is most people, that's the first thing. That's what they do in the first thing in the morning. And it's the first thing they do when they go to bed. They're like scrolling through Twitter until they fall asleep. And that just is not good for your mental health. It was something Jeff and I talked about a lot in the Deadpan Diaries. We were so convinced that social media would be the death of all of us. We were just like, it's so mentally draining. And you know, I think taking this in small doses is probably the best way, because it allows you to also retain your empathy for this stuff. I think, you know, sometimes you're just like, I'm tired of hearing about it. I don't care anymore. You have to think about like how sad that is, that you've worn yourself out emotionally to the point that you don't care about people in your community who have been suffering quietly. And the reality is, if overall we want our community to be a great, happy place, and you don't want to deal with this depressing stuff, that means we have to fix it, or it's going to keep happening. And I think, you know, the other part of this is, the saddest part of it is like just how many people's careers in esports ended early because stuff like this, where they left and they never came back. And so just think about how much better the industry would have been if they'd stayed in, or how much we all would have benefited from their presence or their voice. And that didn't happen because one asshole, you know, did this to them, and their only option was to leave because that person was never held accountable. I think this is something we can all grow from. I think this is something that, you know, if we do this work now, down the line, hopefully we can just have a good time and everyone feels safer and everyone feels happier and everybody, you know, like then it will be drama free. But that work has to be done at some point in time.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, seems like this is the time to do it. We're all stuck inside with coronavirus anyways, and you know, kind of get everyone's act together before the lands start up again and the conventions and all this. But I think it's maybe helpful to try to put yourself in other people's shoes if you start feeling like this is all too much and you don't want to listen to it anymore and you just kind of want it to go away. Because I get it. I've had kind of those feelings because there's been so much, but then I think about everything that esports has done for me and how much I love it and how it's gotten me through hard times. And to see, you know, there are people that have had to quit and not felt comfortable or whatever within the community and have been driven out. And it's like, oh my God, I think it's better to go through this very uncomfortable time and have these hard conversations and do these hard things probably, and, you know, clean it up and make it a safe place for everyone as much as possible.
Yep. A place where respect is universally shared between people. With the earlier point we made about self-care, social media is a space kind of like the rest of the internet where the loudest content gets filtered to the top. So you'll hear a lot of the very worst of things that happen at the top of your feed because it gets the most likes and retweets and things like that. And in the context of this Me Too movement, it's justifiably so. Like, they're taking some control over their life and doing something that allows them to connect with other people who have also survived these kind of things. But there should be a limit on it too for yourself personally. If you've had a really, really terrible day, for you to go through and then browse a bunch of really, really terrible news right after that, we only have so much emotional resource about us in any given day. So you do need to find some spaces for yourself that aren't filled with all of that. Like, just being able to take a walk, be outside for a little bit. Be safe, obviously. Wear a mask, wash your hands. But just opening your window, looking outside, listening to the birds, remembering more of the simple things in life rather than getting fully wrapped up in the next wave of drama, because there's no shortage of drama right now. The question isn't what is the next drama that we can all fuss about. It's when do I need to step back and take care of myself so that I can still make progress in my life and be a good person and a good friend to others. What do you do to recharge if you need to take some time away? Asking the two of you.
Honestly, oftentimes for me, it's StarCraft. If things are like, if I'm having a hard time, like StarCraft has always kind of been my go-to because it's the one way that I can completely clear my brain is playing a hard StarCraft game, right? Like jumping on the ladder, like no matter what I feel like in the first minute of the game, by like minute 3 when I'm being attacked and whatnot and attacking, I just like tunnel vision in and it kind of, it's like meditative in a lot of ways for me. So that's the
Um,
kid. Yeah.
Working out is a big one. I really like lifting. It helps me focus on one thing, you know? It's really hard to think about everything that's happening if I have to focus on lifting X amount of weight off the ground. And the other thing is like working with my hands, which I feel like people don't do that much anymore, but like sewing or like being crafty or working with wood or assembling my Necron army, you know, like I feel like working with my hands is like really relaxing. So miniatures have been like my safe haven lately because it just gives you something small to focus on. And I feel like that tactile experience is really nice, like to just get out of your head and focus on something small or minute in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's what I do.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, I think just getting your brain to focus on something, anything kind of difficult where you have to actually give it attention is going to keep you from, checking Twitter or like overthinking things.
Running is good for me. I run and I don't bring my phone with me, so that's one of the few periods of my week where I'm not connected to something on the internet. I'll bring music with me or just listen to the sounds around me. I really like listening to heavy metal as well. A lot of it has the darker and heavier emotions in it, and for me it's cathartic and helps me to process the trials that I'm going through by listening to something that's kind of angry. I was joking about a Terran player I faced on ladder who actually had a name that was a reference to a metal band that I listened to that's kind of rare. And he was really nice and respectful the whole time. And I had just been BM'd by a couple barcode Terrans a few games ago. And it's like, why are the people who listen to the angriest music so heckin' nice? I don't understand. But it's a way to manage that anger and to channel it into a space that allows you to process it. Anger and a lot of our negative emotion, they need to come out. Like it should flow into something. And as a person, you are a steward of that energy and that emotion. And you should be very careful about where you point that. So you can point that toward lifting weights, toward running, toward listening to heavy metal or whatever your thing is. You should not point that at other people. That's when wrongdoing happens.
Good tip for sure. All right. Is there anything else on the topic that we should address before going to Patreon questions? Anything you guys can think of?
Hang in there, fam. I used to have the tagline "Keep fighting," but we're fighting a lot right now, so hold fast. We'll make it through 2020,
We
I
are
believe.
living in interesting times, but I think uh, the one thing I know is that growth is painful. It is never neat. It is never painless. And I know nobody wants to hear that. But whether we're talking about, physical growth, spiritual growth, mental growth, oftentimes that process is sloppy and it is unpleasant. I mean, look at puberty. It's basically the worst thing ever. And so I think it's important to remember that the labor and the pain we're dealing with now, it's ultimately it's growth. We're growing as a community, we're growing as people, and we're just growing. And so keeping that, I'm not a very positive person, but I've been trying to focus on that positivity, that there is a point to all of this. And that's important to remember, that this isn't just a crappy thing we're going through. And it's, I mean, there's a point to at least some of this, probably not to Corona, but to everything else.
Well,
Yeah.
many of these issues that are coming up are ones that have been more or less swept under the rug for a long time. And we're at that critical mass right now where people want to talk about the issues. So they're putting them front and center, and we need to address this now, which is a good thing. It's an unfun and uncomfortable thing and involves a lot of fighting and a lot of people who are unfollowing accounts based on their political orientation. A lot of families are really divided right now based on these issues. So it's tough, but it's necessary. It needed to happen, basically. So we're working our way through this trial.
Yeah. Very well said, guys. I think we'll probably jump over to Patreon questions. If anyone wants to drop one, do it really, really quick. We don't have too many that are topical this week because obviously we skipped last week's episode, so people were already leaving questions, and then all this stuff kind of started up. The non-topical Patreon questions we will hit on next week. We're not going to talk about GSL champions and things after this conversation, but let me take a quick look here. I believe we have at least a few. Just one second. Okay. Yeah, we do have a few in here. So, some drunk Canadian asks, as a small-time tournament organizer, outside of putting into the rules and enforcing that harassment will not be tolerated and banning players with a history of harassment, what else can I do to make our community safer for everyone? Sending much love from the hometown of some drunk Canadian. So other than putting it in the rules and enforcing that harassment will not be tolerated and banning players with this history of harassment, what else can some of these smaller tournament organizers do to make their communities safer?
I think some of it is involving people in the organization process that might have a different perspective than you. To give a personal anecdote, and I'll try to keep it short. So one of my managers at a retail location I worked at never understood why people, especially women, didn't want to sign up for the closing shift. And the reality is that during the busy hours, there were always two people on shift, and nobody wanted to lock up solo at 10 p.m. at night and then walk through the parking lot after everything else had shut down. This is a perspective that a lot of dudes might not have. And so it's important to listen to things like that. I've said for the longest time that the open bar stuff at TwitchCon and things like that, I always get nervous about it because I think everybody drinks way too much. I think the drinks are not poured properly, things like that. I think being able to be open to that feedback and involving people in the organization process, or at least consulting with people, having a way to get feedback and from people that don't have your perspective. Because the reality is that if you're this big, tall, strong dude, you might not even think about it. You might not even get nervous walking back to your car at 10 p.m. But if you are 5'2" and 120 pounds soaking wet, that experience is very different.
I worked in retail and did the closing shift, and I was one of the only men that actually did that. So I know exactly what you're talking about with that. Yes.
I'm sure you probably had people ask you, people have probably asked you to walk them to their car before. Yeah.
I walked coworkers to their car before through the parking lot and stuff. Yes. So I totally, that rung a bell with me immediately when you said that. How would he go about finding people with different perspectives? It's not like, if you're a smaller tournament organizer, you can't just tweet like, hey, can like some women players tell me what they think about this? Like, is there a certain way to go about trying to identify those things and find those people?
I think just having a way for people to give feedback. I know this probably seems like it's not proactive, but having like a link to some type of Google Doc or a way to give feedback after the fact, and then improving from that every time, or asking people how they found a certain event. It is going to be difficult to get a bigger sample size. But it's one of those things that I think is worth the effort of making sure that you're not just asking the same 5 people, or that if the people you're working with, it's a bunch of dudes, like how do you make it to where, like, start asking the questions of why don't women come to our events? How do we encourage them to come to our events? These are things that I think can help. And talking to other, I would say, larger organizers and seeing what has worked for them, what hasn't worked from them, and learning from their mistakes.
Hmm. Good suggestions. Do you have anything, Nero, that you can think of for helping make tournaments and stuff, communities safer?
From the administration perspective, I don't really have that much that comes to mind. For the individual's perspective, every attendee has an impact on an event. Everyone who shows up, their behavior matters and it sets the tone for what's going on. So that means for every single person, try to be a force of safety, stability, security, and fun for the people around you. Be that respectable person who you think should be in the world. And it makes it a lot more pleasant for everyone there.
Great.
I think celebrating people who already do that as well is good too. Like just identifying the awesome people who are safe and fun to be around. You rock, keep it up. This isn't all about like talking about the bad stuff too. There are a lot of people who are really trying their best and stepping up to the plate when it comes to addressing these situations. High
Yeah.
five.
And actually, you saying that reminds me of something I think you pointed out in our chat before we started the show, how to be a force of safety and security among your peers. I wonder if maybe you wanted to say something on that, because I think we didn't really talk about that, but maybe that's like if you have friends that haven't, because Bronze, you were talking about this a little bit during the show, I think, where it's like if you have friends and they didn't come to you about something, maybe there's something you need to change about yourself that would help with that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think trying to be a good supporter to the people in your life so that they can speak up about these issues, and also doing the uncomfortable work of keeping your friends accountable. Because a lot of us operate in groups, and oftentimes someone will do something that's inappropriate. And I think it's important to step in and be like, hey, I think you should leave her alone. She's a little drunk right now. And that conversation might be uncomfortable, but that has a cascading effect. Knowing that you're the person that holds, other people accountable, people will look at you differently. You will naturally establish yourself as a leader in your friends group or in your community. And that's a good thing. Yeah, I could go on about leadership for for a long time, but exhibiting those types of exemplary behaviors makes people look at you differently. And in some ways, it's a form of, I would call, good manipulation, in which they will slowly start to seek your approval, or they'll care about your opinion. And I think it's more important for people to respect you than it is for them to like you.
Yeah, I would call it correction or giving them feedback on how to behave. There is the bro culture kind of thing of the dudes you're talking about, the pretty girls. Like we all know this from when we were kids of like trying to decide which Disney princess was the prettiest. But as adults, guys talk about their dating life and their relationships and situations, and being able to pay attention to how they're talking about that, the situations that they were in, and being able to call them out sometimes for, yo, that's kind of messed up. You shouldn't do that. It's not fun to call out your friend, but if it's going to mean that they're not doing that moving forward, that's a really key move for you to make. And by making that, you also build confidence for yourself and your ability to be confrontational in situations where it's warranted. The non-confrontational approach is you hear about it and you laugh along with them. And I think a lot of this bad behavior is perpetuated by people who are just kind of laughing along with whatever's been happening instead of people who take a stand when it matters.
Also,
Yeah, being a point of safety and security in an event too, I think involves you being at ease and not trying to push for any particular outcome or to be with anyone in particular. You are steady on your own. And that's something that I think is kind of similar to the way that people carry themselves physically. It's not just what you say, it's also the atmosphere that you have about you that other people can kind of pick up on and detect. And it naturally resonates in groups. Like if someone is really thirsty or really creepy, that changes the overall vibe of the room. If someone is really calm, confident, and steady, that also is a very cool stabilizing force to be around. And try to think about the role models that you see, like people who are confident and awesome. What makes them confident and awesome? Trying to learn from them and understand their perspective
Mhm.
and the path that's led them to that.
Like it.
Shout out to the leaders.
All
Keep it up,
right.
yo.
Well, that was very in depth right there. I hope that helps you out, some drunk Canadian. Thank you for the question. Uh, okay, so Pulse Reaction asks, loved the episode. Going back to serious business, there's this specific situation where a streamer has been harassing another streamer. What can we do if the dude seriously needs psychiatric help and doesn't seek it? Is there anything we can do? So if you're kind of watching this type of situation unfold live in a streaming type situation, how can you impact this? What can you do as just a fan that watches streamers?
The report mechanism is the basically first line of action to take. I can't really guarantee that you're going to get results from that, but reporting doesn't necessarily mean that someone is doing a bannable offense. Sometimes it's a person who maybe is not in a sound state of mind to have their stream online as well. So you could also be doing this in defense of that broadcaster and their mental health. So just saying this is not a healthy stream environment right now for the safety of parties involved. Like we're reaching out with a report on this.
Yeah, I could see that from either side. Yeah.
And I think there's also the fact that you can't force someone to seek any type of mental health. At some level, they have to be willing and acknowledge that they need to do that work. And there's only so much you can do. And that sort of ethical and moral burden shouldn't fall on your shoulders. At that point, what it becomes about is if you've recommended that to somebody and they're not receptive to that and you've tried, I think at that point it's more important to make the person who's feeling harassed feel safe. And if you remove this person, the harasser that is, the reality is they might be forced to confront the fact that they're not okay. They may be forced to confront the fact that their opinion is not the popular one, and they then may go on to get psychiatric help, as you outlined in your question. But ultimately, like if you've tried and you've tried to resolve this and nothing's coming of it because this person refuses to admit they have a problem, you've done what you could do to be kind. And then after that, it's more important to make sure everyone feels safe.
All right. Thanks for the question, Pulse Reaction. Hope that helps. All right. Tentet asks, can you touch on how the MeToo discussion relates to the gaming industry and StarCraft being so male-dominated, and how this conversation is connected to improving that, i.e., the difficult time women have in gaming even outside this topic? Great episode, Heart.
Oh boy. Well, I have experience in Heroes of New Earth, and a lot of online gaming culture is very toxic and hazing oriented, where people will be as nasty as possible to each other to try to make mistakes happen. You try to be really cruel to set them off their game, get them tilted, and that kind of thing. And it's a very destructive way to conduct yourself. But it was an edge that a lot of people considered to be a valid edge for a pretty long time. I think over the past decade or so, it's been shifting more and more toward respect is cool in gaming. I was very amazed at the GLHF and GG in the StarCraft scene when I joined, that there was a culture of manner. And I thought that was really cool and awesome. But that's just a starting point, right, for treating each other well. Uh, Many times when a woman is playing a game and the other players in the game find out that it's a woman, they will treat him very differently. Basically, it becomes a dating platform instead of a gaming platform. And that incentivizes women basically to not reveal their gender and their identity, which is really messed up if you think about it. They can't focus on the game. Many of them feel like they shouldn't use voice comms because people are going to treat them differently as a result. And that needs to change. Basically, respect the person's choice to share your passion and your hobby. Know them playing the game is not the stepping stone to a relationship. They're simply playing the video game. Allow them to do so.
I think the other part of this is that this extends to beyond gaming, unfortunately. I think it's any environment that people typically attribute with, like, men. For me, it was Magic the Gathering. I've dealt with more crap from Friday Night Magic than any gaming session, which I know is probably a shocker. Like I had less trouble in Call of Duty lobbies than I ever had at Friday Night Magic. The amount of crap I had to deal with there was insane, and I just wanted to show up and play cards. I didn't want to do anything else. And the reality is that there's this idea that you have to prove that you deserve to be there. And for a long time, that burrowed itself into my brain. And I think that's why we, like a lot of women, tend to exit these industries. I'm a big comic book fan. You could tell from my backdrop. That's a Doctor Strange #1, subtle flex. And there's some things like I don't know about comic books. I know a lot about certain comics, but there's a lot of comic books out there and I can't be an expert on every single one. But being on multiple comic book shows, the second I would slip up or not know something about the Fantastic Four because I don't like them and I don't read those books, immediately your right to be there is called into question. You're the diversity hire, and the dudes that are there that don't know anything, they're fine, they're real nerds, but you're the one that you didn't know this thing about this obscure comic from the 60s, so it makes you doubt yourself. And then you're just like, well, I clearly don't belong here. I don't deserve to be here. Or, I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I am a fake fan. And I think it's like starting to change those perceptions. So, and people are like, oh, well, girls suck at games. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of dudes suck at games too. A lot.
That's
like, right?
sure.
Roasted.
Like I used to raid competitively in WoW. And, the amount of dudes that sucked at that game was insane. Were there a lot of women who sucked? Yeah, I'm not going to lie. But there's a lot of dudes that suck too, but you never hear that brought up. And I'm just like, y'all are bad as well. So I don't think that's a valid argument for why we don't see that many women in gaming.
Mm-hmm. All right. Excellent answers. Thank you for the question, Tentat. Looks like we have one more here from Fridgerator. He asks, of the stories that I have read that tangibly connect to the StarCraft community, one conclusion I've come to is that the people telling their stories often aren't necessarily looking for people to be punished, but for awareness, solidarity, and support. Any thoughts on that matter? Much love, Art.
Yeah, that sounds like the almost summary of what we've been trying to do with this conversation, because we are not a jury. This is not a set of judges who are laying out the cases and deciding who's guilty and who's not. Like, what we are trying to do here is bring these issues to light and try to support this community that we love and the people within it who have been taking these risks to share their stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also a part of the healing process for a lot of people. There is a catharsis inherent with unburdening yourself. For a lot of people, this is about closure. And I think it's really important to note that. For a lot of people, this is them speaking their truth. This is them acknowledging that something bad happened to them or that they've been quietly struggling with this behind the scenes. And so in a lot of ways, it's ripping the Band-Aid off. And I think that's why you see a lot of these threads or tweet longers. They start with, I'm not looking for a witch hunt. They very specifically state, I don't want this person to be canceled, or I don't, but it's about seeing other people share their stories. This is kind of an online support group in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people are looking for validation because, like we talked about earlier, sometimes people don't really know what they went through. They have, this is something that happened to them, and then they speak about it online and everyone says, that was awful. I am so sorry that happened to you. And suddenly their hurt feels like they're allowed to have it. I think sometimes we need somebody to tell us that we're allowed to feel strongly about this topic, or that we're allowed to be hurt about this. And that validation is important.
It's true. And some people will resist these kinds of stories because it's hurtful to hear about it. But that pain is so much less than actually going through it. So it's kind of a least you can do situation with the self-care concept in mind, where you're not overdoing it and put yourself in too many emotionally heavy situations. But still, to hear about it, it's not nearly as taxing as the people who are going through that. So really trying to resonate with them and to think about how much struggle they've been through going through all this, and being able to back them up moving forward, like cheer for them, encourage them, when other situations and red flags come up, be more attentive to that than we have been in the past. This is kind of a collective conversation that we're having in let's all try to be better moving forward. And these instances, these stories that we're getting are failings of the community, situations where we didn't do the right thing. And being able to see those situations and also understand why that's not the right way to behave and what we should do instead is the take home here.
Yeah. All right. Great answers. Thank you, Refrigerator, for the question, and thank you to everyone who threw some questions in there. That actually ends the Patreon questions on the subject, and so that kind of brings us to a close for the show. I want to again thank you both for coming on. Really, I thought that this was going to be a very difficult episode, and while it kind of was a difficult episode, I think you guys had some really great stuff to add to the conversation. So thank you so much for that. Before we go, why don't you guys tell people where they can find you and follow you? Any closing thoughts, anything like that? Neuro, why don't we start with you?
I have a handy dandy, lovely link tree that has all my stuff. I'll post in the chat here. I stream on Twitch. I have YouTube videos updated pretty much daily. I have a Patreon page that is more of suggesting and voting on how you want to direct the creative flow. And one of the main things that is a primary emphasis and mission for me is trying to challenge people to be more mindful of themselves, their emotions, their conduct, and their words. Where I play StarCraft as the primary game, and I play World of Warcraft. I main tank and guild lead on the weekends. I'm in a D&D campaign, but the major, I guess, goal of me through being Neuro on Twitch and on YouTube is to really have the character building conversations, the ways that we can compete, that we can create, share in art and laughter and together, but also be aware of how we can all improve together. I kind of think about my community and my scene like its own dojo where people, they show up and we spar, we train, we discuss, and we learn. And hopefully you leave that experience more inspired, more emboldened, and more courageous than you were before you came in. So it's not a place where we're just shooting the shit and having a good time, which we do plenty of, but it's also a challenge for you to step up and be a better person and to really rock your own narrative and story in life.
Great. And Bronze Girl, how about you? Where can people find more of you and check you out?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at that Bronze Girl. You can also find me on Twitch. I host a daily morning talk show where I talk about honestly whatever's on my mind. We talk about a lot of heavy topics sometimes, a lot about history, and a lot about things like this, honestly. And if you're interested in seeing more great conversations like this I've had, I'm a big fan of my project I did with In Control TV, Deadpan Diaries. You can check it out on YouTube. And you can get a taste of some of the conversations. What I try to do on my stream is kind of an extension of that because that was a passion project of mine. And yeah, I'm a variety caster. I do play games and I really love games like XCOM, and I'm getting into Warhammer. And so, yeah, you can look forward to some miniature painting streams on my stream soon, hopefully.
Excellent. All right. Well, that about does it. Big thanks to the Pylon Show staff for making all this happen. And again, thank you both so much for coming on. And thank you everyone for watching. I hope you all take this conversation to heart and we can make the community a better place. So thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you again next week.
Shout out to the Pylon Show, the greatest show on the internet.